Hey guys, tonight we're settling into something a bit different. Picture yourself sinking into one of those ridiculously plush velvet chairs. You know, the kind that probably cost more than your car and definitely has better health insurance than you do. We're talking full Elizabethan palace vibes here. The air around you is thick with that intoxicating mix of old parchment and wood smoke from a crackling hearth. Basically the medieval equivalent of that expensive candle you bought but never light because it was $30. You can almost hear it, can't you? That faint scratch of quill on paper. Someone setting down secrets in ink. The kind of secrets that could topple kingdoms, or more likely, get you a really unpleasant meeting with some very unfriendly people holding very sharp objects. This isn't your average study. This is where the world's most guarded secrets were read aloud, not shouted from rooftops like some medieval Twitter rant, but whispered, analysed, and filed away by people who understood that information wasn't just power, it was survival. So here we are, dear listener, stepping into that quiet authority, that carefully orchestrated hush. Tonight we're exploring a reign that was basically spun from gold thread and held together with invisible duct tape. Queen Elizabeth's rule, absolutely glorious, sure, but also perpetually one bad day away from complete disaster. We're not talking about armies marching across fields here. No, the real threats were tiny, meticulously planned plots and folded, coded letters passed between conspirators like the world's deadliest game of telephone. Imagine having a shadow guardian, completely unseen but always there, whose entire job was basically being the world's most paranoid babysitter. Their vigilance became the only thing standing between England and complete chaos. This isn't your standard history lesson, guys. Think of it more like a slow-burn psychological thriller. We're calling it The Puritan's Shadow. It's a tale woven with absolute devotion, some genuinely breathtaking spycraft, and those quiet, persistent moral tremors that come with living a life where your day job involves reading other people's mail and occasionally arranging for them to have very bad accidents. We'll dive into that complex dance between being deeply religious and being absolutely ruthless. The unwavering belief that God wanted you to protect Protestant England, even if the methods you used would probably make that same God reach for the holy water. Now, before we go any further, here's a gentle nudge. If you're finding yourself settling into this long, calm night portrait of history, maybe give us a quiet like or subscribe. I'm always curious where you guys are listening from. Drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. It always blows my mind how people are falling asleep to this stuff all over the world. As our imaginary fire casts those long dancing shadows, we're going to journey through the strategic architecture of England's first real spy service. Think of it as the CIA, but with more doublets and significantly less dental coverage. We'll uncover the infamous honey trap that completely destroyed the Babington plot. And yes, it's exactly as dramatic as it sounds. We'll watch the methodical recruitment process, peek into the mysterious black chamber where secrets went to get thoroughly violated, and trace the clever smuggling operations and early cryptanalysis that basically shaped a nation's survival. And yeah, we'll touch on the melancholy epilogue too, the personal price that gets paid when your entire life revolves around necessary paranoia and state-sanctioned skullduggery. So let's step closer and meet the man who made the conscious choice to live in those shadows, Sir Francis Walsingham. He was the architect, the guy spinning the web, the one person who understood better than anyone why England, if it wanted to survive, absolutely needed a spider. A very well-informed, slightly terrifying spider. Picture a guy who looks like he's perpetually waiting for bad news. Lean, sharp-eyed, probably the type who'd check his phone 17 times during a dinner date. This was Sir Francis Walsingham, and his official title was Principal Secretary of State to Queen Elizabeth I. Now, that sounds about as exciting as a tax audit, but here's the thing. It basically meant he was the head of MI6, the State Department, and your neighborhood's most paranoid gossip all rolled into one terrifying package. He grabbed this job on December 20th, 1573, and for nearly 17 years, until he died on April 6th, 1590, His entire existence was basically one long, exhausting episode of political thriller meets religious crusade. We're talking secret negotiations, international espionage, and enough backstabbing to make a reality TV show look tame. But here's where it gets interesting. For most people, religion is that thing you do on Sundays, maybe Easter, if you're feeling ambitious. Not Walsingham. For him, faith wasn't a hobby, it was his operating system. He was what contemporary sources called a rank Puritan, which in 16th century speak basically meant he was the kind of guy who thought Catholics were not just wrong, but actively dangerous to society. Think of someone who believes their political views are literally ordained by God, and you'll start to get the picture. This wasn't just some casual prejudice either. Walsingham had the kind of quiet, burning zeal that made spying on people feel less like a morally questionable career choice and more like divine service. In his mind, protecting Protestant England wasn't just good politics. It was a sacred mission straight from the Almighty himself, which, probably made the paperwork feel a bit more meaningful. Let's walk through a typical morning in the Walsingham household. Picture this guy starting his day with what was probably intense, whispered prayer, the kind where you're basically having a strategy meeting with God about your enemies. You can almost hear him in the pre-dawn chill of his London home, asking for guidance, and maybe just a tiny bit of divine approval for the morally ambiguous things he was about to do. Then, and this is where it gets cinematic, the prayer book snaps shut. Game time. He'd transition straight from talking to God to sitting in closed council meetings, his brain already shifting gears from spiritual devotion to cold, hard political calculation. Threats to assess, alliances to navigate, plots to uncover. Just another day at the office, except the office happened to be running the intelligence operations for an entire kingdom. This moral certainty of his was both his superpower and probably what kept him awake at night. Imagine being in a room when Walsingham decided someone's mail needed to be accidentally intercepted. The guy doesn't raise his voice, doesn't make threats. He just speaks with this quiet, absolute conviction that what he's ordering isn't just necessary, it's righteous. The kind of hush that would fall over that room wasn't fear exactly. It was the recognition that you were witnessing someone who genuinely believed God was on his side. His opposition to Catholicism went way beyond your average political rivalry. This was personal. When he interrogated Catholic prisoners, he wasn't just fishing for confessions or state secrets. He was genuinely trying to understand how these people could be so fundamentally wrong about everything. In his worldview, Catholics weren't just political opponents, they were heretics, enemies of both the state and divine truth. Which probably made those interrogations particularly unpleasant for everyone involved. But Walsingham wasn't content to just suppress Catholic influence. He was actively trying to build Protestant dominance. He funded lectureships at Oxford, essentially investing in the next generation's theological education. He supported the production and distribution of Protestant texts, including helping with the New Testament at Rheims. Basically, he was waging ideological warfare through academic publishing, which is either brilliantly strategic or deeply nerdy, depending on how you look at it. His disdain for Catholic practices was legendary, and he viewed every Catholic mission to England as a direct existential threat. We're talking about a guy who established what were essentially internment camps for priests, and directed investigations with the kind of relentless focus that would make modern intelligence agencies take notes. No half measures, no benefit of the doubt. If you were Catholic and operating in England, Walsingham considered you guilty until proven innocent. And even then, he'd probably keep an eye on you. Now take a slow, deep breath. Feel yourself settling into your comfortable modern life, where religious persecution is mostly a historical concept, and government surveillance requires at least some paperwork. Let your mind drift to the smooth, waxed surface of Walsingham's desk, probably stained with ink from 1,000 intercepted letters and secret reports. It's from this very desk, this nerve center of faith-driven espionage, that we'll explore the intricate network he built to protect his queen and his version of God's kingdom on earth. And yes, all of this, Walsingham's dates, his religious fervour, his absolutely exhausting dedication to Protestant England, is thoroughly documented in the biographical studies that historians still pore over today. So here you are, cosy in your modern world, maybe with a cup of tea getting cold beside you, and we're about to dive into what was basically the geopolitical equivalent of being surrounded by people who really, really want you dead. Picture Queen Elizabeth, lone Protestant ruler, sitting on her throne like the last person at a party where everyone else has decided you're the problem. Catholic Europe didn't just disagree with England's religious choices. They saw the entire country as a cosmic mistake that needed fixing, permanently. The moment everything really went sideways happened on February 25th, 1570. That's when Pope Pius V basically hit the nuclear button, spiritually speaking. He issued this papal bull called Regnans in Excelsis, which sounds fancy until you realize it was essentially the Pope's way of saying Elizabeth is cancelled. The decree declared her a heretic, stripped her of any legitimate royal authority, and, here's the real kicker, told all her Catholic subjects they didn't owe her any allegiance whatsoever. Think about that for a second. The Pope literally gave divine permission for anyone who wanted to overthrow or assassinate the Queen. It was like getting a papal hall pass for treason. Not exactly what you want to wake up to on a Tuesday morning. This wasn't just religious drama either. It had immediate, catastrophic political consequences. Religious tensions in England went from simmering to full boil overnight. Being Catholic in England suddenly wasn't just about which church you attended on Sunday. It was about whether you were potentially planning the Queen's murder. Elizabeth, understandably, developed some trust issues with her Catholic subjects. This led to increasingly harsh laws against recusants, those stubborn folks who refused to show up to Anglican services, and a relentless hunt for Catholic priests, who were now viewed less like spiritual leaders and more like foreign agents with really good disguises. Diplomatic relations with Catholic countries, especially Spain, went from "we don't really like each other" to "we're basically enemies who happen to share the same continent." When the Pope declares open season on your monarch, small talk at international summits gets pretty awkward. And then there was Spain. Oh, Spain. Under King Philip II, who was both deeply devout and seriously ambitious. Never a great combination when you're dealing with international relations. Philip saw himself as Catholicism's champion, which meant England under Elizabeth was like a giant Protestant middle finger pointed directly at everything he stood for. He wasn't just annoyed. He had strategic reasons for wanting England back in the Catholic fold. Philip wanted to squash what he saw as heresy, sure, but he also had his eye on England's growing maritime power and those incredibly lucrative trade routes. Basically, he wanted to weaken England's influence in a Europe that he believed should be united under Catholic rule, with him as the obvious leader, naturally. English Protestants had every reason to be terrified of a Spanish invasion. This wasn't just about losing a war, it was about losing everything. A successful Spanish conquest would mean the end of their religious freedom, the dismantling of Elizabeth's carefully constructed religious settlement, and the return of papal authority over every aspect of their lives. For people who had grown up Protestant, this was like being told your entire way of life was about to be erased and replaced with something you'd been taught to fear. Philip's constant financial backing of Catholic rebellions in England and Ireland, plus his enthusiastic support for various plots to overthrow Elizabeth, only made these fears worse. The threat of the Spanish Armada, which would eventually show up in 1588, felt like a sword hanging over their heads, ready to drop at any moment. So when Walsingham looked out across his country and beyond its borders, he wasn't seeing a peaceful kingdom enjoying its independence. He was seeing a beleaguered island, a Protestant outpost surrounded by hostile Catholic powers who had both the motivation and the resources to destroy everything he held dear. Every coded letter arriving from the continent, every whispered conversation in a tavern, every new face at court, each one could be carrying the seed of England's destruction. This makes Walsingham's seemingly paranoid behavior start to look a lot more reasonable. His relentless pursuit of intelligence, his expansion of spy networks, his willingness to use morally questionable methods. Suddenly it all feels less like the actions of an overzealous spy master and more like the desperate measures of someone trying to keep his country from being wiped off the map. The broader threats, papal excommunication, Spanish military might, Catholic Europe's united hostility, these weren't just abstract political concepts. They were the driving forces behind every policy decision Walsingham made, every spy he recruited, every letter he intercepted. The historical sources from this period make it crystal clear that these external pressures were the foundation of everything Walsingham built. Now, let yourself sink a little deeper into that comfortable spot where you're listening. Feel the tension of that dangerous world and then let it drift away. You're safe here, warm and secure, hearing this story by the gentle glow of modern lighting. Take a slow breath, letting all that historical anxiety dissolve, as we prepare to explore exactly how Walsingham built the incredible network that kept England from crumbling under all that pressure. Right, so Walsingham had his motivation sorted, burning religious conviction, and a kingdom absolutely surrounded by people who'd love nothing more than to see his queen very, very dead. But here's the thing. How exactly do you build a spy network in the 1500s? There's no CIA recruitment website, no spies are us in the yellow pages. This was basically like trying to create MI6 from scratch, except you're doing it mostly with your own money and whatever sketchy characters you can convince to keep their mouths shut. Picture Walsingham putting together his own twisted version of Ocean's 11, except instead of Danny Ocean recruiting safecrackers and con artists, he's scouting for bookworms, traveling salesmen, and actual criminals. He wasn't looking for guys who could leap from rooftops or seduce enemy agents, though that comes later. He wanted people who could disappear into a crowd, listen carefully, and most importantly, not immediately run off to brag about their secret mission at the nearest tavern. What he created was actually pretty revolutionary for its time. Historians now recognize it as England's first real intelligence service, basically the granddaddy of modern MI6. But back then, it probably felt more like the world's most dangerous startup, run on pure paranoia and whatever spare change Walsingham could scrape together. His recruitment strategy wasn't exactly subtle, but it was personal. No mass hiring events or job fairs. This was all done in quiet rooms, away from curious eyes, with handshakes that carried the weight of state secrets. Walsingham understood something crucial. Different jobs needed different people. You wouldn't send a scholar to infiltrate a criminal gang, and you definitely wouldn't trust a reformed pickpocket with your most sensitive code breaking. First up, the nerds. Where do you find brilliant analytical minds who are already used to spending their nights hunched over incomprehensible texts? Oxford and Cambridge, obviously. These weren't your stereotypical ivory tower academics. Well, some were, but Walsingham specifically wanted the ones with useful skills. Linguists who could handle multiple languages, classical scholars who understood ancient texts, and crucially, the early mathematics geeks who could wrap their heads around cryptography. Picture some poor professor who thought he'd spend his career peacefully translating Latin texts, suddenly finding himself bent over cipher alphabets at midnight, trying to decode intercepted Spanish correspondence that might reveal the next assassination attempt. The scratch of his quill in the candlelight, working through letter substitutions that could mean the difference between life and death for his queen. Some did it for patriotic fervour, others for the intellectual challenge. And let's be honest, plenty did it, because Walsingham offered better job security than most university positions. Then there were his eyes and ears abroad, merchants and travellers. These guys were absolutely perfect cover agents because they had legitimate reasons to be everywhere, talking to everyone and asking questions about local conditions. They'd sail from London to Antwerp, from Calais to Madrid, their cargo holds filled with wool and grain, but their real cargo was information. These merchant spies developed networks across Europe, trading gossip as easily as they traded goods. They learned who was saying what in which port, which nobles were getting cozy with Spanish agents, and whether anyone was moving unusual amounts of money or troops around. Picture a merchant stepping off a ship, still carrying the salt tang of foreign harbours in his clothes, sitting down with Walsingham's people to casually mention that, oh yes, while selling fabric in Bruges, he happened to overhear some very interesting conversations about English Catholics and their Spanish friends. And finally, for the really dirty work, the stuff that required people comfortable with shadowy corners and questionable morals, Walsingham turned to criminals. Reformed criminals, technically. The deal was simple. Stay in prison and probably die there eventually. Or take this nice clean cloak, a bit of spending money, and a chance to serve your country by doing exactly the kinds of sneaky things you're already good at. These were perfect for infiltrating Catholic communities within England, keeping tabs on suspected conspirators, or just generally lurking around places where respectable people wouldn't be caught dead. They knew how to blend into crowds, how to gain trust without seeming suspicious, and how to disappear when things got dangerous. Sure, their loyalty was basically transactional. They were getting paid to stay out of jail, but in Walsingham's world, any loyalty was better than none. The actual recruitment scenes weren't dramatic movie moments with mysterious meetings in abandoned warehouses. They were almost domestic, quiet conversations in unremarkable rooms. Maybe a scholar getting quietly approached after a university lecture, a merchant being offered a slightly unusual shipping contract, or a thief in a cell suddenly finding himself with a visitor bearing very interesting propositions. Picture these moments, the soft rustle of parchment as someone signs onto a life of secrets, the gentle clink of coins changing hands, the whispered instructions that could never be written down, the smell of ink and candle wax, the texture of rough paper under nervous fingers, all the mundane details that surrounded these extraordinary decisions. Walsingham's approach was genuinely groundbreaking. He didn't just want to collect random information. He wanted to process it, analyze it, turn isolated facts into coherent intelligence that could actually be used. He understood that you needed different types of sources, reliable ways to communicate, and people smart enough to figure out what all the pieces meant when you put them together. Now, we should probably mention that while we know the broad strokes of how Walsingham recruited his people, scholars for code breaking, merchants for foreign intelligence, criminals for domestic surveillance, some of the specific details are educated guesses based on what we know about intelligence practices of the time. But the general categories, the types of people he used, and the revolutionary nature of what he built, that's all well documented in the historical record. Take a slow breath here, letting the tension of all this intrigue settle. Feel the roughness of old parchment under your fingertips. Smell that faint scent of ink and ambition that must have hung around Walsingham's operations. This was how a kingdom under siege began fighting back in the shadows, thread by careful thread, creating something that would keep England safe for generations to come. All right, so Walsingham had assembled his ragtag team of scholars, merchants, and reformed criminals. But here's the thing about collecting intelligence. It's like having a really messy inbox. Getting information is one thing, but actually processing it, understanding what it means, and turning it into something useful. That's where things get interesting, and for that, Walsingham turned to the most boring, yet absolutely crucial technology of his time, the mail system. Think about the mail back then. It was basically the internet, except slower, less reliable, and with absolutely zero security features. No passwords, no encryption, no spam filters. Just guys on horses carrying leather bags full of other people's secrets. But Walsingham looked at this completely vulnerable system and thought, you know what? This is basically a nationwide wiretapping operation just waiting to happen. Every courier trotting along those dusty English roads, probably humming to himself and thinking about what he'd have for dinner, was unknowingly carrying state secrets straight into Walsingham's waiting hands. These poor guys had no idea that the innocent-looking letters they were protecting would soon be carefully opened, read, copied, analysed, and sometimes even edited before being sealed back up and sent on their way. It's like if someone was secretly reading all your text messages, except with more horses and significantly worse Wi-Fi. This wasn't some amateur hour operation either. Walsingham had created what historians now call the Black Chamber, which sounds way more dramatic than it actually was. This wasn't some gothic torture dungeon with chains hanging from the walls. It was basically a really boring office, probably smelling faintly of ink and vinegar, we'll get to why in a second, staffed by what were essentially the world's first data analysts. Just a dim, quiet room where the fate of England got decided by people with really good handwriting and an unhealthy obsession with other people's mail. The whole process was like a carefully choreographed dance, except instead of music, you had the soft rustle of paper and the occasional quiet curse when someone messed up a wax seal. When a suspicious letter arrived, and Walsingham's network made sure plenty of interesting mail came their way, it would take a little detour before reaching its intended recipient. First step, getting the thing open without it looking like you'd rifled through someone's personal correspondence. This is where things get technical in a weirdly domestic way. The basic method involved carefully steaming letters open, like you're trying to unstick a stubborn envelope without tearing it, but the really advanced techniques used chemical solvents, probably mild acids like vinegar, which explains the smell, to soften the wax seals just enough to lift them off intact so they could be reused later. Picture some poor specialist sitting there with a tiny brush, carefully applying vinegar to a wax seal like they're doing delicate restoration work on a priceless painting, except the painting is actually a letter that could start a war. Once they got the letter open, skilled scribes would quickly copy everything down. These weren't just secretaries taking dictation. These were the people who had to perfectly reproduce someone else's handwriting while working fast enough that the letter could get back on schedule. Then the copies went to Walsingham's codebreakers, those scholars we talked about earlier, who would spend hours staring at what looked like complete nonsense until patterns started to emerge. But here's where it gets really devious. Sometimes Walsingham's people didn't just read the letters, they edited them. They had forgers who could mimic anyone's handwriting and postal agents who were basically inside men in the mail system. Imagine someone carefully copying a nobleman's distinctive signature flourish, or a postmaster casually handing over a letter to one of Walsingham's agents like, "Oh, this one? Yeah, it needs to take a quick detour. A changed date here, an added meeting location there, or maybe altering some crucial instruction." These tiny modifications could turn allies into enemies, expose hidden conspirators, or lure targets into carefully prepared traps. It was like editing someone's social media posts, except with potentially fatal consequences. You can almost hear it, can't you? The soft whisper of parchment being carefully unfolded and then refolded, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of a quill as someone copied down potentially treasonous correspondence, the quiet murmur of specialists debating whether a particular squiggle was a coded symbol or just bad penmanship. These small, almost imperceptible sounds created the gentle yet tense rhythm of England's first intelligence processing centre. And this wasn't just some theoretical system that looked good on paper. This was a fully operational, highly effective mail surveillance programme. We know this because Walsingham was terrible at keeping secrets about his own methods, and plenty of historical records document this elaborate system of postal interception and code breaking. He basically turned England's mail system into the kingdom's nervous system, with every important message eventually flowing through his quiet little office, full of very dedicated, very nosy people. It's actually pretty remarkable when you think about it. Without satellites, without fibre optic cables, without any of our modern surveillance technology, these folks managed to create an intelligence operation that could uncover the most carefully hidden plots just through patience, skill, and an absolutely obsessive attention to detail. All right, so Walsingham had built this elaborate spy network, intercepting mail left and right. But here's the problem. The really important letters, the ones worth stealing, usually looked like someone had sneezed alphabet soup onto parchment. Nothing but symbols and numbers that might as well have been a medieval capture test. This is where Thomas Philippes enters our story. And trust me, this guy was the definition of quiet genius. Philippes was Walsingham's chief codebreaker, basically the world's first professional puzzle solver, whose day job happened to involve life and death consequences. Picture this, a solitary figure, hunched over his desk well into the night, lit by a single flickering candle that probably cost more than most people made in a week. The room would be dead silent except for the rhythmic, almost hypnotic tap of his quill and the soft whisper of parchment as he methodically worked through cipher alphabets, slowly unlocking coded phrases that must have felt like heartbeats in the darkness. This wasn't some flashy spy movie scene with high-tech gadgets and dramatic music. This was pure brainpower meets extreme patience, combined with the kind of deep understanding of linguistic patterns that would make a modern computer programmer weep with envy. Plus, an eye for subtle details that most people would completely miss. Felipe's was basically the MVP of Walsingham's operation, playing crucial roles in almost every major intelligence success. But his most famous performance was during the Babington plot, where he spent months meticulously intercepting, decoding, and then, here's the clever bit, re-encoding correspondence between Mary, Queen of Scots, and her co-conspirators, especially this guy Anthony Babington, who clearly should have stuck to less treasonous hobbies. But Felipe's wasn't just sitting there passively reading other people's mail like some Tudor-era gossip columnist. Oh no. This guy was actively manipulating the intelligence, playing psychological games that would make a modern-day social engineer take notes. His signature move was the forged postscript, which sounds boring until you realize it was basically the 16th century equivalent of catfishing, but with potential execution as the penalty for falling for it. Here's how it worked. Felipe's would intercept a coded letter from Babington to Mary, spend however long it took to decode the thing, and then, this is the brilliant part, he'd forge an additional postscript in Babington's handwriting. And this wasn't just copying someone's signature. This was capturing the nuance, the specific quirks, the actual voice of the original writer well enough to fool someone who'd been corresponding with them for months. In this cleverly forged edition, he'd casually ask Mary to name her principal contacts within England. Basically, hey, while we're planning to murder the Queen, could you give me a quick list of everyone else involved? You know, for organizational purposes. Picture the scene. Felipe's, after probably 6 hours of squinting at coded nonsense, finally cracks the message and discovers it's all about assassinating Elizabeth. The weight of that knowledge settling in his stomach. Then, with the steadiest hand in England, he dips his quill into the ink and, with careful, controlled precision, writes what amounts to a death warrant for multiple people. You can almost hear the soft rustle of paper, the scratch of his quill against parchment, and then that tiny triumphant ink blot as he finishes forging a name that will seal someone's fate. The really beautiful part? It worked perfectly. Mary, completely falling for the deception, cheerfully provided the names of 6 prominent Catholic noblemen, inadvertently signing their death warrants and tightening the noose around her own neck. It's like if someone asked you to list all your accomplices in a crime, and you just did it, helpfully. In writing, Felipe's also used what we now call frequency analysis, which sounds simple but required the kind of mental stamina that would exhaust a chess grandmaster. He'd notice which symbols appeared most often, deduce they probably represented common letters like E or T, and then use those deductions to gradually unravel entire codes. Sometimes he'd even play psychological warfare, sending encrypted messages he knew would fall into enemy hands, designed to mislead them or confirm false assumptions. His forgery skills weren't limited to postscripts either. Felipe's and his team could mimic specific seals and copy the distinct handwriting styles of various foreign agents and conspirators. This meant they could not only read enemy mail, but send convincing, misleading replies. It was basically early psychological warfare conducted through really good penmanship. To really appreciate the genius involved here, try to imagine yourself in Felipe's position. Just breathe slowly. Let your mind settle into that rhythm. The quiet, almost meditative nature of the work. Ink to paper, cipher to plain text, over and over again. The tiny, precise movements of his hand forming each letter. The intense concentration required to make sure there's no slip-up, no telltale sign that someone's been tampering with the mail. You might picture the faint smell of lamp oil in that cold room, the chill that probably made his fingers stiff, and then that incredible moment of satisfaction when a jumbled mess of symbols suddenly resolves into a clear, damning confession that will probably get someone's head chopped off. The evidence for all of this, Felipe's cipher work, the famous postscript trick, the whole elaborate system, isn't just historical speculation. We've got the actual intercepted letters, his reports to Walsingham, even some of his practice sheets. This stuff really happened, which means that underneath all the grand political drama of Elizabethan England, there was this quiet genius working diligently in a dim room, armed with nothing but ink, paper, and an absolutely terrifying level of intellectual precision. Mary, Queen of Scots, was basically Elizabeth I's most expensive, most dangerous houseguest, who just wouldn't leave. For nearly 2 decades, Mary lived under what we might generously call house arrest in England, getting shuffled around between different manor houses and castles like the world's most high-maintenance prisoner. Her final stop was Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire, which sounds appropriately dramatic for someone whose life read like a soap opera written by Shakespeare. Now, you might picture some dank, rat-infested dungeon with chains and mouldy bread. But Mary's imprisonment was more like being stuck in a really nice hotel where you can't leave and there are armed guards watching your every move. She had her own household, servants, decent food, and could spend her days doing embroidery or reading, basically all the activities of a wealthy noblewoman, except for that pesky little detail about being completely unable to go anywhere ever. Picture her sitting by a locked window, staring out at the English countryside, probably thinking something like, well, this is my life now. She knew she was living on borrowed time, a royal prisoner whose mere existence gave Elizabeth chronic headaches, and the whole time she was constantly writing letters and receiving them from an endless parade of conspirators who saw her as their ticket to making England Catholic again. It's genuinely tragic when you think about it. A queen who was simultaneously a prisoner and an irresistible magnet for every Catholic plot in Europe. So why did everyone keep trying to rally around Mary? She wasn't just any deposed monarch collecting dust in exile. To many English Catholics, she was the rightful Queen of England, and Elizabeth was basically a Protestant usurper whose parents' marriage was questionable at best. Contemporary accounts from the period make it clear that Mary had serious influence among English Catholics and pretty much anyone on the continent who wanted to see a Catholic back on the English throne. She wasn't just a convenient figurehead. She was a symbol of hope for people who wanted to restore what they saw as the true faith. Her personal charisma, her status as a long-suffering royal martyr, and her family tree, she was Elizabeth's cousin and Henry VIII's great niece, made her an incredibly powerful symbol for anyone unhappy with the Protestant direction England had taken. Mary's unique position as both a legitimate claimant to the throne and a devout Catholic made her the obvious focal point for basically every anti-Elizabeth plot you could imagine. Conspirators, whether they were English Catholics plotting from their country estates or Spanish agents working from abroad, all saw her as the perfect replacement for Elizabeth. Her correspondence became absolutely crucial. These letters were her lifelines to a vast network of people who wanted Elizabeth dead and Mary on the throne. Even under house arrest, her rooms became like the headquarters of intrigue, with plots being hatched and plans being communicated through a surprisingly sophisticated system of secret correspondence. Picture this quiet scene. A locked window overlooking the countryside, beyond which a whole world of schemes and ambitions was constantly churning. Some innocent courier, probably thinking he's just delivering beer, places a letter sealed inside a watertight container into a beer keg for clandestine transport. He has absolutely no idea that he's carrying correspondence that could start a war or get a dozen people executed. Later, in Mary's chambers, you might hear the soft echo of prayers whispered in French, a language that connected her to continental Catholicism and set her apart from the English court that held her prisoner. And here's the really cruel irony. Despite being the constant focus of all these elaborate plots, Mary was also completely trapped by them. Her survival depended entirely on outside help, but that help usually meant getting dragged into schemes that would ultimately seal her doom. It was this vicious cycle of hope and betrayal, all playing out right under Elizabeth's nose. Now, as you listen to this, maybe pull those covers up a little higher. Settle into your cozy bed where you're safe and warm. There's something deeply comforting about knowing that Mary's gilded confinement and all the dangerous games swirling around her exist safely in the past, contained within the story we're sharing. The danger and intrigue of her world can't touch you here. You're just an observer, watching from centuries away as a queen, even one imprisoned in luxury, becomes the unwitting centre of a kingdom's deepest fears and most dangerous ambitions. The historical evidence for all of this, Mary's various prison locations, the conditions of her confinement, and her central role in attracting every Catholic conspiracy of the era, is thoroughly documented, making her one of the most fascinating and tragic figures in this whole Tudor drama. So there's Mary, sitting in her gilded prison, basically acting like a conspiracy magnet whether she wanted to or not. But Walsingham wasn't content to just watch these plots unfold from the sidelines. He needed to actively manage them, to control the whole show. What he needed was the perfect honey trap, bait so irresistible that the conspirators would practically throw themselves into his web. And that bait came in the form of a young man named Gilbert Gifford, who was about to become history's most successful double agent. Gifford was exactly the kind of guy Walsingham specialised in recruiting, the type who looked perfect on paper but had just enough moral flexibility to be useful. On the surface, he was a zealous young Catholic, eager to serve the cause and restore England to the true faith. But underneath all that pious enthusiasm, he was the kind of person whose loyalties could be negotiated, let's say. He had what you might diplomatically call a complicated past, including a previous arrest for seditious activity, which made him vulnerable, and therefore, in Walsingham's calculating mind, absolutely perfect for manipulation. The way Gifford got turned wasn't some dramatic spy movie scene with torture and threats. It was more like a really high-stakes job interview where failing meant potential execution. Gifford had gotten himself arrested in Paris, basically finding himself in the 16th century equivalent of being caught with your hand in the cookie jar. That's when one of Walsingham's agents, a guy named Thomas Morgan, showed up with what must have seemed like a miracle offer. Not just a way out of his current predicament, but a chance to gain wealth and influence while supposedly serving his Catholic beliefs. Facing potential ruin and probably a very unpleasant death, Gifford made what was probably the easiest decision of his life. He agreed to become England's first major double agent. His cover story was perfect. He'd present himself as a loyal Catholic courier, willing to risk everything to smuggle letters between Mary, Queen of Scots, and her fellow conspirators. The only tiny detail he'd leave out was that every single message passing through his hands would make a quick detour to Walsingham's Black Chamber before reaching its destination. Picture Gifford in action. Charming smile, earnest demeanour. Probably the kind of guy who could convince you to trust him with your life savings. He had this way of reassuring nervous conspirators that he was completely dedicated to their cause, that their secrets were safe with him. And technically, he wasn't lying. Their secrets were very safe indeed, just not in the way they thought. Gifford became absolutely crucial to the Babington plot, essentially creating what the conspirators believed was a secure communication channel between Mary and Anthony Babington's group. This channel, which they thought was their secret lifeline, was actually being run like a Walsingham production, with every detail carefully monitored and controlled. His job sounds simple, but it was incredibly dangerous, basically playing both sides while making sure neither realized he was double-crossing them. He'd intercept letters that had been hidden in the most ingenious places, often stuffed into beer barrels or sealed in waterproof packets tucked into the bungholes when ale was delivered to Mary's household. Then he'd hand these letters over to Walsingham's people, who'd rush them to Thomas Philippe's for decoding, copying, and sometimes a little creative editing. Only after Walsingham knew exactly what the conspirators were planning would the letters continue on their journey, with everyone none the wiser. The whole operation depended on trust, Specifically, the conspirators' complete faith in Gifford and their belief that they were using an undetectable communication system. They thought they'd found the perfect way to secretly coordinate with their imprisoned queen, when in reality, every single word they wrote was being read, analysed, and filed away by Walsingham's intelligence operation. Let's focus on that brilliant beer barrel trick for a moment. Picture the scene, the satisfying clank of wooden barrels being rolled into Mary's residence, looking like nothing more than a routine ale delivery. Then, in a furtive hush, maybe under cover of darkness or during the busy chaos of unloading, someone would slip a small, carefully waterproofed packet containing crucial letters into a specially prepared hole in the barrel's side. The conspirators would be sitting around, probably biting their nails with anxiety, waiting for replies from their imprisoned queen, hoping their elaborate plans were finally coming together. Meanwhile, Walsingham was already reading those replies, sometimes hours or even days before they reached Babington and his friends. Gifford sold this performance completely. With his seemingly genuine enthusiasm for the Catholic cause, he established what appeared to be an ironclad correspondence route between Mary and her co-conspirators. What they didn't know was that Walsingham's people had compromised the entire system from day one. Gifford wasn't just carrying their letters. He was providing detailed intelligence to Walsingham about the conspirators' movements, their identities, their evolving plans, basically everything except what they had for breakfast. He was the ultimate double agent, carefully feeding just enough believable information back to Catholic networks to maintain his cover, while channeling all the really incriminating evidence straight to Walsingham. It was like being a mole in the world's most dangerous organisation, except the penalty for getting caught wasn't just losing your job, it was losing your head. Take a slow breath here. Let yourself settle into the rhythm of this story. Picture the grain of that wooden beer barrel. Feel the subtle warmth of freshly poured ale. Hear that faint sound of the bung being carefully, quietly replaced. These small, trustworthy details anchor us in the reality of this elaborate deception. It was all a trap, you see, carefully constructed, perfectly baited, with Gilbert Gifford as the honeyed lure that drew the conspirators deeper and deeper into Walsingham's web. And the historical record makes it crystal clear. Gifford's role as a double agent, his central function in the smuggling operation that linked Mary with her conspirators, and his ultimate betrayal of their trust are all meticulously documented. He was the key that unlocked the entire conspiracy for Walsingham, the perfect piece of bait in the most sophisticated intelligence operation of the age. All right, so we've met Gilbert Gifford, Walsingham's star turncoat, the perfect double agent who could charm the pants off a nun while secretly working for the other side. But here's the practical question. How exactly did these incriminating letters, the ones that would eventually get people's heads chopped off, physically travel back and forth between Mary, Queen of Scots, and her fellow conspirators? The answer is going to sound absolutely ridiculous. Beer. Specifically, really, really clever beer delivery. This wasn't some James Bond gadget fest with hidden compartments and laser watches. This was brilliantly, almost insultingly simple, relying on a method so mundane that it was practically invisible. The whole operation ran through a local brewer, just some regular guy who happened to be one of the tenants on the land where Mary was being held at Chartley. This poor fellow had no idea he was about to become an unwitting star in the greatest spy operation of the 16th century. Here's how it worked, and honestly, it's kind of genius in its sheer audacity. The brewer would make his regular deliveries of fresh ale to Mary's household. Completely normal, completely expected, zero reason for anyone to be suspicious. But hidden inside the bunghole of these beer barrels, often right in the corkstopper itself, was a small waterproof canister. Think of it as the Tudor equivalent of a dead drop, except instead of a hollow tree, they were using beer barrels. Mary would slip her coded letters to the conspirators into this little container, and the conspirators would use the same method to send their replies back to her. The beauty of it was that the people carrying these messages, the actual couriers, genuinely believed they were pulling one over on Walsingham and his spies. They thought they were smuggling secrets right under the noses of Elizabeth's guards, when in reality, they were basically hand-delivering evidence straight to the prosecution. This method was particularly brilliant because it exploited something so routine that it was completely beneath suspicion. I mean, who's going to question a beer delivery? It's like someone today being suspicious of the UPS guy. It's just part of the normal background noise of daily life. The brewer would roll up with his barrels, probably whistling some cheerful tune, completely oblivious to the fact that his cargo contained the literal blueprints for overthrowing the Queen of England. But here's where Walsingham's genius really shows. He didn't just intercept these letters occasionally. He controlled the entire channel, completely and absolutely. His agents, probably disguised as local villagers, or maybe even infiltrating Mary's household staff, would intercept every single barrel, remove the letters, and rush them to a nearby safe house. Probably just some ordinary-looking cottage that wouldn't attract attention. Picture the scene in this safe house. The wet, earthy smell of beer barrels. Maybe the faint aroma of spilled ale mixing with the nervous sweat of agents working under serious pressure. This wasn't glamorous spy work. It was careful, methodical, and probably pretty nerve-wracking. Walsingham's handlers would extract the waterproof packet, send the letters off to Thomas Philippus for his decoding magic, and then wait for approval to send them back. Only after Walsingham had read every word, analysed every detail, and sometimes had Philippes add those cleverly forged postscripts we talked about earlier, would the letters continue on their journey. The replies would be carefully placed back into the canister, resealed and returned to the beer barrel. The brewer, still completely clueless about his role in all this, would eventually pick up his empty barrels and unknowingly deliver the responses back to the conspirators. The level of precision required for this operation is honestly mind-blowing. They had to be able to open and reseal the bung of a beer barrel without leaving any trace that it had been tampered with. They needed to handle delicate letters, make copies, and then replace everything so perfectly that not a single fold or crease would be out of place. Even the wax seals had to look completely undisturbed. It was like performing surgery on someone's mail while they were sleeping in the next room. You can almost picture the whole clandestine process, the satisfying thunk of a wooden barrel being positioned just right, the careful, almost surgical movements of hands slipping letters into prepared hiding spots, the anxiety of waiting for just the right moment when no one was looking. The entire operation was like a perfectly choreographed dance of deception, with Walsingham conducting the whole orchestra from behind the scenes. And this isn't just some clever theory historians cooked up. The beer barrel method, complete with waterproof containers hidden in the bungholes, is thoroughly documented in the historical records. Walsingham's total control over this communication channel, how he intercepted every message, read every word, and decided exactly what information would flow back to the conspirators, is all laid out in the surviving accounts of the Babington plot. So take a slow breath here, dear listener. Let yourself imagine these gentle, repetitive motions, hands carefully opening the bung, extracting the hidden cylinder, copying down treasonous words, then meticulously resealing everything back exactly as it was. It's almost rhythmic, like a lullaby for spies, this quiet ritual of deception that happened over and over again, week after week. It really is a testament to human ingenuity, and maybe a reminder that sometimes the most effective tricks are the ones hiding in plain sight, camouflaged by the completely ordinary rhythms of everyday life. Who would suspect a beer delivery of being the linchpin in the most sophisticated intelligence operation of the age? All right, so we've covered how Walsingham built his spy network, recruited double agents, and basically turned beer delivery into the most sophisticated intelligence operation of the 16th century. But here's the thing about intelligence work that nobody tells you. Most of it is mind-numbingly boring. Or, more specifically, it requires the kind of supernatural patience that would make a monk weep with envy. Walsingham had turned waiting into a quiet, deeply unsettling art form. This guy wasn't the type to make dramatic, spur-of-the-moment decisions. No grand gestures, no theatrical flourishes. Walsingham's true genius lay in his absolutely ruthless strategic patience. Once Gilbert Gifford had set up the secret beer barrel communication channel and Thomas Philippes was working his cryptographic magic on Mary's correspondence, you might think Walsingham would immediately swoop in for some dramatic arrests. Wrong. That would be way too hasty for someone with his Puritan sensibilities. Instead, he waited, and waited, and then, just for good measure, he waited some more. For weeks, then months, those beer barrels kept rolling in and out. Letters were intercepted, copied, resealed, and sent on their merry way, while Mary and her fellow conspirators just kept digging themselves deeper into their own graves with every carefully crafted, incriminating word they wrote. This wasn't just about collecting enough evidence to make a case stick. Any competent lawyer could probably have done that after the first few letters. No, this was about building something absolutely bulletproof. Walsingham wanted the conspirators to ensnare themselves so thoroughly that there could be absolutely no doubt, no possible wiggle room, no chance for anyone to claim they were innocent bystanders who'd been misunderstood. Picture the scene in the Black Chamber. New letters arriving pretty much daily. The familiar smell of vinegar briefly mixing with dust and candle wax, as seals were carefully opened, scribes making their copies, Philippes hunched over his cipher work, and then Walsingham himself reading every word, assessing each new piece of evidence, each fresh name mentioned, each increasingly bold plan described in loving detail. And then, after all that analysis, he'd make the calculated decision to let it continue. It's genuinely a form of terrifying performance art when you really think about it. The slow, methodical unraveling of a web, but not with some sudden dramatic yank. Instead, it's this deliberate, almost imperceptible tightening of threads, one tiny adjustment at a time. There's no big theatrical moment, no dramatic confrontation, just the quiet, methodical accumulation of absolutely damning proof. And that's exactly what makes this whole thing feel like a psychological thriller, even though we're telling it in the most soothing way possible. It's the knowledge that somewhere in the background, a noose is being tied, one careful knot at a time, entirely by the people who are about to end up wearing it. The timeline of Walsingham's surveillance operation is genuinely impressive in its scope. Historical documents show that he was intercepting correspondence between Mary and Babington for several months before he made a single arrest. Months. He just let the whole thing develop, drawing in more participants, allowing the assassination plans to become more specific and detailed, waiting for Mary's explicit written consent to murder Elizabeth. He wasn't going to move until he had that smoking gun in black and white, or rather, in code that had been thoroughly cracked and decoded. And when he finally did decide the evidence was overwhelming, the coordinated strike was a thing of beauty. This wasn't some haphazard roundup where they grabbed whoever they could find and hoped for the best. Walsingham orchestrated a simultaneous sweep across England, ensuring that all the key players got arrested at roughly the same time, preventing any chance for one person to warn the others that the game was up. Picture his agents positioned across the country, probably sitting in taverns or loitering around market squares, all waiting for the same signal, ready to move in perfect unison. It's honestly a pretty chilling example of strategic execution, especially considering they didn't have phones or radios or any way to coordinate except through pre-arranged timing. Let the gentle rhythm of this whole process settle over you. He waited, he read, he copied, he analyzed, he waited. It was a completely conscious decision to hold back, to let the danger actually grow, all in service of achieving absolute, unshakable security when the hammer finally fell. The risk, obviously, was that the plot might succeed before he was ready to act. But Walsingham was the kind of gambler who only played when he'd already stacked the deck, patiently collecting every single card he needed. The documentary evidence from this period makes it crystal clear. There was this extended interception phase, followed by carefully orchestrated, simultaneous arrests. Walsingham's own reports and correspondence reveal a clear, deliberate strategy of allowing the conspiracy to fully mature, so that when it was finally exposed, the evidence would be so overwhelming that nobody could possibly argue with it. It's a pretty stark reminder that sometimes the most powerful action you can take is the one you deliberately delay, methodically preparing the ground for consequences that become absolutely inevitable. And it's this quiet accumulation of detail, this rhythmic pulse of secrets being uncovered one letter at a time, that draws you deeper into the uneasy dreams of England's most dangerous century. All right, so we've covered all the waiting, all the careful setup, the incredibly patient way Walsingham spun his web like some kind of Elizabethan spider with a really good pension plan. Now we get to the absolute, undeniable gotcha moment, when the net finally snapped shut and the conspirators' own words became the rope that would literally hang them. This is where Anthony Babington writes what might be the most spectacularly stupid letter in the history of treason, and Mary, Queen of Scots, basically signs her own death warrant in reply. Picture the scene in Walsingham's Black Chamber when this particular letter from Babington arrived via the usual beer barrel route. This wasn't some vague, maybe we should do something about Elizabeth kind of correspondence. Oh no. This letter was explicit, detailed, and about as subtle as a brick through a window. Babington laid out the entire plot to assassinate Elizabeth I, coordinate a Spanish invasion, and put Mary on the English throne. It was like receiving a business plan for regicide, complete with timelines and everything. You can almost see Felipe sitting at his desk, probably with that same meditative focus he always had, setting to work on this absolute gift of evidence. The familiar scratch of his quill, the soft rustle of parchment as he meticulously translated those coded symbols into perfectly damning English. Babington's letter was basically a confession written in advance. The plan to kill Elizabeth, when the Spanish invasion would follow, how they'd free Mary from her gilded prison. It was so comprehensive that it left absolutely no room for anyone to claim this was just theoretical discussion or harmless daydreaming. And then Felipe's made what might be the most brilliant move in the history of espionage. Before sending the decoded letter on to Mary, he added that forged postscript we talked about earlier. You know, the one where he basically asked Mary to provide a handy list of all her co-conspirators. It wasn't just clever, it was a psychological masterpiece. He specifically asked her to name all the gentlemen involved in the plot. Think about it. He was literally asking her to write down the names of everyone who should be arrested when this whole thing went sideways. Now, take a moment here and hold your breath. This was it, the turning point. Everything hinged on Mary's response. When her reply finally arrived, same beer barrel system, intercepted by Gifford, rushed to the Black Chamber, decoded by Felipe's. The contents were everything Walsingham could have hoped for, and probably more than he dared expect. Mary's reply, dated July 17th, 1586, wasn't just agreeing to the plot. She was enthusiastic about it. She explicitly gave her consent to Elizabeth's assassination and expressed her eagerness for her own deliverance. It was like she'd taken the prosecution's case and gift-wrapped it for them. And here's the detail that makes this story absolutely perfect. Felipe's, in his annotated copy of Babington's original letter, added a tiny sketch of a gallows in the margin. Just a little drawing, but it was basically his way of saying, these people are so dead. The impact of these decoded letters was immediate and absolutely devastating. They proved beyond any doubt that Mary wasn't just some innocent victim caught up in other people's schemes. She was an active, enthusiastic participant in a plot to murder Elizabeth and overthrow the government. This was exactly the clear, unambiguous evidence that Elizabeth and her Privy Council had been waiting for. The kind of proof that would justify taking action against a fellow queen, despite all the potential diplomatic consequences. Now, let that tension we've been building reach its absolute peak at the moment that final, incriminating reply was decoded and read. Picture Walsingham's quiet satisfaction, Felipe's probably very restrained sense of nailed it, and then just breathe out slowly. Let all that tension go with one long, calming exhale. What follows isn't the chaos you might expect. but something much more unsettling. A calm that settles over the room. Not a peaceful calm, but the kind of grim, methodical resolve that comes when all the pieces finally fall into place. All that waiting, all the risk of letting a genuine assassination plot develop, all the meticulous intelligence gathering was finally paying off. The quiet machinery of the Elizabethan state was preparing to move, and when it did, it would move with the kind of unstoppable, terrifying certainty that only comes with absolutely bulletproof evidence. And here's the thing that makes this story even more chilling. We're not just telling you a dramatic tale. The actual decoded letters still exist in historical archives, complete with Felipe's annotations and that famous little Gallows sketch. These are real documents that you can go look at today. They're irrefutable proof that this whole elaborate conspiracy existed, that it was exactly as dangerous as Walsingham believed, and that words, once hidden in code, could literally become the instruments that decided who lived and who died in Elizabethan England. Right, so Walsingham finally had his smoking gun. Mary, Queen of Scots, had basically written her own confession and mailed it directly to the prosecution. Now came the part that probably gave him the most satisfaction. Watching his carefully constructed web snap shut like a perfectly engineered trap. This wasn't going to be some messy, drawn-out manhunt where people escaped through windows and fled to France. This was going to be surgical. A clean, efficient sweep that would demonstrate exactly why you don't mess with someone who's spent months reading your mail. Picture the sudden, eerie quiet that would descend on taverns and country houses across England, like that moment in a western when the saloon piano stops playing. The coordinated arrests following the Babington letter interception were designed as a 16th century shock and awe campaign. Once Elizabeth and her Privy Council got the full briefing on just how damning Mary's correspondence was, Walsingham basically hit the go button on what was probably the most organised police operation in English history up to that point. This wasn't going to be some half-hearted attempt to round up whoever they could find. This was a deliberate, simultaneous dragnet that would have made modern law enforcement jealous. Within days of Mary's incriminating letter being decoded, Walsingham started issuing arrest warrants like he was handing out party invitations. On August 15th, 1586, Anthony Babington himself, the guy whose name was on the whole conspiracy, got picked up. Over the next few days, his co-conspirators, 14 of them in total, were systematically collected from their homes, their favourite drinking spots, and whatever hideouts they thought were clever. There's something genuinely chilling about the quiet efficiency of it all. Think about that feeling when you realise a net is tightening around you, except these guys probably didn't see it coming until the very last second. The midnight knock on the door that shatters your false sense of security, the sudden interruption of a peaceful evening meal, the cold, unforgiving clang of iron shackles being locked around wrists, the confused faces that quickly turn terrified as the reality sinks in. All across England, at roughly the same time, Walsingham's intelligence operation transformed into the machinery of justice, and that machinery was grinding very efficiently. For the conspirators, the legal process was about as swift and brutal as you'd expect from Elizabethan England's approach to treason. Their trials began on September 13th, 1586 in Westminster Hall. There was no presumption of innocence here, no lengthy appeals process like we're used to today. Treason trials in this era were essentially elaborate ways of confirming that yes, these people were definitely guilty, and yes, they were definitely going to die horribly for it. The whole thing was designed to get through the formalities quickly, and then put on a public spectacle that would make anyone else think twice about plotting against the crown. The conspirators got divided into two groups for their trials, probably for logistical reasons more than anything else. The first group, including Babington, received the full horrific penalty for treason, being drawn, hanged, and quartered. This absolutely barbaric punishment was carried out on September 20th, 1586, at St. Giles in the Fields, deliberately staged as a public event designed to send the clearest possible message to anyone considering similar activities. The second group got executed the next day, though apparently there was enough public outcry over how brutal the first executions were that they were allowed to die by hanging before being cut up. Think about the human cost for a moment. The midnight knock that completely destroys any illusion of safety in your own home. The shocking coldness of metal restraints against skin. The absolute terror on the faces of family members who suddenly understand their loved one isn't coming home. The families left behind, instantly plunged into financial ruin and social disgrace. Their names forever associated with treason. These weren't just entries on some government list. They were real people with real lives, hopes, relationships, all of which got brutally severed by the state's machinery. Their only real mistake was trusting their letters to the wrong postal system and betting their lives on Walsingham's carefully orchestrated deception. Let's pause here for just a moment. Picture the soft spread of candlelight flickering in windows as these arrests unfold across the country. Brief glows of warmth against an overwhelming darkness. Then let my voice guide you back, gently and calmly, to the safety of the present. The state's case against these men was absolutely unshakable, built methodically piece by piece, word by damning word, by Walsingham and his incredibly dedicated team. The historical records give us a disturbingly clear picture of these coordinated arrests and the legal procedures that followed. These documents stand as undeniable proof of just how precisely Walsingham could dismantle a conspiracy when he put his mind to it, leaving absolutely no doubt about the conspirators' guilt and no possible escape from the ultimate penalty. It's a sobering reminder of just how ruthlessly efficient Elizabethan justice could be when it was powered by truly sophisticated intelligence work. So the Babington conspirators had been rounded up and processed through Elizabethan justice with all the efficiency of a medieval assembly line. But the really big prize was still sitting in her gilded cage. Mary, Queen of Scots herself. With all that evidence carefully gathered, copied, decoded and triple-checked, the stage was set for her trial. A carefully choreographed public event that was less about finding out the truth and more about putting a legal stamp of approval on what everyone already knew was going to happen. Mary's trial, which kicked off in October 1586, was unlike anything England had ever seen. Instead of being held in London's prestigious Westminster Hall, it took place right at Fotheringhay Castle, where Mary was imprisoned. This was probably to keep the whole thing contained. No point in giving her access to sympathetic crowds, or turning her into more of a martyr than necessary. This wasn't just any trial. This was the legal proceeding against an anointed queen, Elizabeth's own cousin, and it needed to be handled with the kind of extreme care you'd use when defusing a bomb while wearing evening gloves. The moral and legal choreography was incredibly intricate, designed to create the appearance of a fair process, while ensuring that everyone involved knew exactly how this was going to end. And the star evidence, those intercepted letters from Babington, along with Mary's incredibly incriminating replies that basically amounted to a written confession. Picture the scene. A sombre hall in Fotheringhay Castle, decorated not for celebration, but for judgment. It's like the world's most depressing dinner party. Surrounding Mary sat a commission of 42 English noblemen, privy councillors and judges. Basically her accusers, her jury and her judges, all rolled into one convenient package. Mary initially denied legal counsel because apparently due process was more of a suggestion in those days, was forced to defend herself against charges of plotting Elizabeth's death. She kept insisting that as an independent monarch, she couldn't be tried by an English court, which was legally sound, but about as effective as arguing with a brick wall. The prosecution, led by Elizabeth's most ruthless legal minds, laid out their case with the kind of devastating precision that would make modern prosecutors weep with envy. They presented both the original coded letters and Felipe's decoded versions to the court. These documents had been handled by Walsingham's Black Chamber with the care of museum curators dealing with priceless artifacts. Expert witnesses, including some of Mary's former secretaries who had been persuaded to testify, confirmed that yes, This was definitely Mary's correspondence, and yes, she was definitely up to her neck in the whole assassination plot. The really clever part was that because the letters had been intercepted, copied, and then allowed to continue to their destinations, the conspirators had essentially authenticated them by responding to them. It was like a legal trap so sophisticated that it would have impressed Rube Goldberg. For the court, these pieces of paper became the foundation for a death sentence. Mary's defense strategy was basically to claim she knew nothing about any assassination plot. She was only interested in plans for her liberation from prison. Unfortunately for her, the letters proved otherwise, explicitly showing her enthusiastic consent to Elizabeth's murder. In the methodical, solemn atmosphere of the trial, with the whispers of observers, the shuffle of papers, and the low rustle of robes as commissioners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the whole thing unfolded like a slow, tragic play where everyone already knows how it ends. The authenticity of Walsingham's evidence, particularly those Babington letters, was absolutely crucial. Elizabethan treason trials operated under a legal framework that basically allowed intercepted correspondence to be presented as ironclad proof, even when it wasn't always independently verifiable. The combined testimony of her secretaries and the sheer volume of intercepted communications painted a picture of guilt so clear that even a blind person could have seen it. Take a moment here to notice these small human details and let them settle over you like a gentle blanket. The rustle of paper as damning evidence gets laid before the commission. The quiet deliberation, punctuated by the occasional cough or the soft whisper of a clerk making notes. It's a somber dance, moving with the inevitability of gravity toward its tragic conclusion. The commission found Mary guilty on both counts, conspiring against Elizabeth's life and plotting against the realm, confirming their judgment on October 25th, 1586. Her fate was sealed not by any single dramatic moment, but by a steady stream of words, methodically intercepted and decoded over months. This wasn't just a political decision disguised as a legal proceeding. It was setting a precedent. Words that had once been secret, flowing silently through beer barrels and hidden in wax seals, had become the unshakable foundation for executing a queen. All of this, the trial proceedings, the evidence presented, especially those crucial Babington letters, and Felipe's direct involvement in providing authenticated, decoded documents, is extensively documented in primary trial records and forms a cornerstone of historical scholarship on Mary's conviction. It's a stark reminder that intelligence, even the quiet kind that happens in dimly lit rooms with patient scholars bent over coded letters, can be the most powerful weapon of all when it's wielded with cold, calculating precision. So Mary, Queen of Scots, was found guilty. But here's the thing about executing a queen. It's not exactly something you can just casually add to your to-do list between feed the horses and check the castle walls. This was unprecedented, the kind of decision that would have made even the most hardened politicians break out in a cold sweat. It took months of agonizing deliberation within Elizabeth's Privy Council, with Elizabeth herself going through what can only be described as the world's most consequential case of decision paralysis. She famously kept signing the death warrant and then dramatically recalling it, like someone trying to decide whether to send a really harsh text message. She'd sign it, then panic and demand it back, desperately seeking some other way, any way, to avoid such a drastic measure. But the political pressure was absolutely crushing, and the threat to her life and Protestant England was too great to ignore. Finally, under what must have felt like the weight of the entire kingdom, and with the full backing of her council, Elizabeth gave her permission for the execution. So, on a bitter cold morning, February 8th, 1587, the axe fell. The setting was Fotheringhay Castle, the same place where Mary had been tried and imprisoned, which feels appropriately grim and final. Picture the scene, the great hall of the castle, completely transformed for this horrible ceremony. The air would have been absolutely freezing, probably with that hushed electric feeling you get when everyone knows something terrible and historic is about to happen. The assembled witnesses, Noblemen, knights, and the executioners, who probably weren't having their best day either, would have been watching as Mary made her final entrance. She was dressed in a black gown over a crimson petticoat, which was the colour of Catholic martyrdom, basically making a statement right up to the end. What's remarkable is that she walked to the scaffold with incredible dignity and composure, like she was heading to a formal dinner, rather than her own execution. Her final speech was calm, but defiant. She declared her innocence of any plot against Elizabeth's life, while affirming her commitment to her Catholic faith. She forgave her executioners, which honestly shows more grace than most people manage on a good day, prayed in Latin, and then, after her ladies-in-waiting helped her remove her outer garments, she knelt before the block. The dull thud of the axe would have cut through the hushed silence like a gunshot, a sound that echoed not just through the castle walls, but through the entire political landscape of Europe. It apparently took 2 blows to fully sever her head, which is exactly the kind of detail that makes you grateful for more modern methods. The executioner then held up her head, declaring, "God save the Queen!" But as he did, Mary's small dog, which had been hidden in her skirts, emerged whimpering and covered in her blood, adding a heartbreaking, almost cinematic detail to an already gut-wrenching scene. The emotional aftermath was intense and complicated. Elizabeth's reaction was famously one of complete despair, mixed with theatrical rage. She claimed to be heartbroken, insisting that she'd been betrayed by her own Privy Council, particularly Secretary Davison, who had expedited the warrant after she signed it. She went into deep mourning, basically exiled Davison, and refused to see Walsingham for a while, like she was giving him the royal equivalent of the silent treatment. Whether this grief was genuine, pure political theatre, or some complex mixture of both, is something historians are still debating. What's clear is that she understood the massive cost of what had just happened, both morally and politically. This wasn't just executing a traitor. This was executing another queen, her own cousin. And that kind of precedent had consequences that would ripple through European politics for decades. For Walsingham, this was the ultimate, bitter price of security. His intelligence work had proven Mary's guilt beyond any doubt, and demonstrated the existential threat she posed to everything he held dear. The execution, though officially sanctioned by Elizabeth, represented the culmination of his relentless efforts to protect his queen and the Protestant state. It was a heavy decision, but in his deeply Puritan mind, it was absolutely necessary. England's safety, he believed, had been purchased with blood, and that was a price he was willing to pay. Take a moment here to feel that cold morning air, hear the heavy thud of the axe, sense the collective intake of breath from the witnesses. Then let that grim image soften and fade. Think instead about duty and the quiet rooms where the people who make these terrible decisions sit alone afterward, probably wondering if they did the right thing. Walsingham, the meticulous architect of this tragic outcome, wasn't the type of man who celebrated victories like this. He was someone with profound conviction who had done what he believed was absolutely necessary, but he was probably haunted by just how far he'd had to go to preserve his country. We know all these details because the sources for Mary's execution are extensive and well documented. Contemporary accounts, official dispatches, eyewitness statements that paint a vivid, if grim, picture of what happened on February 8th, 1587. They also confirm Elizabeth's complex and often contradictory responses to the death of her cousin. It brought an end to more than 4 decades of plotting and counterplotting, but it left a permanent stain on Elizabeth's reign and created a legacy of debate that historians are still working through today. So Mary, Queen of Scots, got her guilty verdict, and despite Elizabeth having what can only be described as the world's longest anxiety attack about actually going through with it, the execution happened. But now we need to pull back from the immediate drama at Fotheringhay and look at the bigger picture, the wider legacy of Sir Francis Walsingham, the guy who basically built England's first invisible security system. Because his work wasn't just about stopping one conspiracy, it was about protecting England from what felt like an endless parade of people trying to kill his queen. Walsingham's intelligence network, that motley crew of scholars, merchants, and reformed criminals we've been following, became absolutely crucial in the years leading up to the Spanish Armada in 1588. While the Babington plot dealt with the major domestic threat, Walsingham's agents kept busy across Europe, feeding back intelligence on Spanish preparations for what everyone knew was coming, a massive invasion attempt. His network was basically providing England with daily updates on everything Spain was doing: troop movements, naval preparations, strategic planning, the whole works. This allowed Elizabeth and her commanders to anticipate and prepare for the attack instead of just hoping for the best and crossing their fingers. This constant flow of information was absolutely foundational to preserving what we now think of as Elizabeth's golden age, giving England the chance to counter threats before they fully developed. But what happened to our spider himself? What was Walsingham's reward for saving a queen and, arguably, an entire nation? Well, he kept serving as Elizabeth's principal Secretary of State until his death in 1590. And here's the kicker. Despite his absolutely monumental service to England, Walsingham died broke. Completely, utterly broke. He passed away deeply in debt, having basically bankrupted himself funding his intelligence operations because apparently the Tudor government's expense reimbursement policy was about as reliable as the weather. The reward for his tireless, often completely thankless work wasn't wealth or public recognition or even a decent pension plan. It was just the quiet knowledge that he'd kept England from falling apart, which, you know, is noble and all, but probably didn't help much when the bill collectors came knocking. Picture him in those final years, a man who wielded enormous behind-the-scenes power, who knew Europe's deepest secrets, who had quite literally shaped the course of history, and yet he was probably worrying about paying his household expenses, like any normal person struggling with their budget. The image of Walsingham alone at his desk at the end is genuinely heartbreaking. All the tools of his trade, the cipher alphabets, the foreign dispatches, the reports from agents across the continent, all neatly packed away. Not because he was retiring to enjoy his golden years, but because he was simply finished. Empty pockets maybe, but a nation that was undeniably safer because of his almost completely anonymous guardianship. Let's take a moment to recap what we've wandered through tonight, tying together all the threads of this complex historical story. Walsingham, driven by his deep Puritan faith, served as Elizabeth's principal secretary and methodically built what became England's first real intelligence service, specifically designed to catch plots like Babington's that threatened both his queen and his vision of Protestant England. The Babington plot itself, which aimed to assassinate Elizabeth and replace her with Mary, was brilliantly unravelled from the inside. Gilbert Gifford, posing as a devoted Catholic courier, actually worked as Walsingham's double agent, completely controlling the secret communication channel. They used that ingenious beer barrel smuggling method to pass letters back and forth to Mary's prison. Thomas Philippus, Walsingham's cryptographic genius working in quiet obscurity, decoded all the incriminating correspondence, including Babington's stupidly explicit assassination plans. Philippes then pulled off that masterful forged postscript trick, basically tricking Mary into providing a handy list of all her fellow conspirators. Her reply, enthusiastically agreeing to Elizabeth's murder, became the unshakable evidence they needed. Mary's trial and execution at Fotheringhay Castle in 1587 followed directly from these decoded letters. Those words on paper, once secret, once flowing through beer barrels, became the foundation for a death sentence, effectively eliminating the biggest threat to Elizabeth's reign. And Walsingham himself. He died in 1590, reportedly with almost no personal wealth despite his incredible service to England. But that intelligence network he'd built, refined during the whole Babington operation, continued to provide vital information that helped England anticipate and prepare for the Spanish Armada and countless other threats to national security. The quiet moral of Walsingham's story really is the price of peace. England slept safer because of his work, but the spider himself got very little public recognition and paid for his service with isolation and financial ruin. He basically traded his personal comfort and security for his country's survival. Now, as you start to drift off, let me leave you with a few gentle questions, just in case your mind wants something quiet to ponder, without any urgency, just peaceful curiosity. You might find yourself wondering which of those original intercepted letters, the actual documents from Babington and Mary, still exist today, and where historians go to study them. Or maybe you're curious about the most detailed contemporary accounts describing Thomas Philippus's code-breaking techniques, beyond the general methods we've talked about tonight. Perhaps you'd like to know how Walsingham's groundbreaking spy network evolved into later Elizabethan security operations, and by extension, how it influenced the development of modern intelligence agencies over the centuries. And finally, you might wonder whether any of Walsingham's personal letters survive that reveal his private thoughts about all this deception he orchestrated in service of the crown, whether he had doubts, moral struggles, or just accepted it as necessary. Thanks for joining me tonight on another journey into the quiet corners of history. I'm always curious where you guys are listening from as you drift off to sleep, so feel free to drop a comment with your location. Until next time, let these questions and this story settle gently in your mind as you ease into peaceful dreams. Sleep well.